Yeah.
That's
Black
really
people,
the problem.
they were running for office in Georgia and Florida, and they disenfranchised hundreds of thousands of people.
Wisconsin just did.
Right, I read about that.
Filed by the judge.
So
We're
the
talking
Russians
about
forget
that.
it.
Another thing they don't talk. Another thing they don't talk about the fact that we rigged Russia's '96 election against the Communist
I
Party.
remember
And every other
I remember
country in
that.
the world is still last.
Yeah.
Yeah, because they thought the Supreme was going to win.
That's
Reading
not
the
Ricky.
polls, the next thing you know.
That's
No.
not, that's
Boris
not
Yeltsin
as
was
bad.
right there.
That's not as bad.
Boris Yeltsin was like the most unpopular person in Russia, and he somehow won the election because we rigged it. Yeah. Yeah, Yeltsin had the worst economy Russia had since World War
But I
I.
ate before I got there.
Communists always had economic troubles. Yeah, that's why when it was first founded, it was a feudal state, and it eventually
We're gonna start this up, guys.
All right, should we get started, everybody?
Yep.
All right, I'm Jason. I guess first of all, let's all just go around and introduce each other, and maybe you could also just say, especially if you weren't here last week, if you have read the text, and you know, if you just read it, or you know, anything that you, yeah, just basically have you read the text yet or not? And you know, last week we did part one, so if you're not familiar with part one, maybe we could do a quick recap of it. So yeah, so I'm Jason with CWL.
That's Abiyumi there.
Abiyumi's over there.
I'm David.
Ken?
I'm Sharon, and I didn't read the text.
I'm Derek. Ray.
Dave, I've seen the text.
Mike, I read it many, many years ago.
Rebecca, I haven't read it, but I'm a fast reader.
Tom, I've read it a few years ago.
Nathan, I've read it before.
Alex read it before.
Jackson, I've read bits and pieces.
All right, cool. So I guess, should we do a quick, sorry.
Wondering, do we do some announcements of upcoming events?
Yeah, anybody want to make announcements?
Yeah, I'd like to. On Monday, there'll be the second solidarity demonstration. It's in solidarity with the Wet'suwet'en Nation, which is in a struggle in British Columbia, which the Canadians refer to as British Columbia. And they are trying to stop an oil pipeline from coming across their land. So in a lot of ways, they're the front line right now of the struggle against climate change. So we'll have a demonstration at the tunnel from 3:30 to 5:30 on Monday. That's about 2 or 3 towers from the Canadian consulate. We were in front of the Canadian consulate last week, and then we moved to the tunnel and found it to be much more effective because we really annoyed some of the people going back to Canada. We hit a nerve. So we want to do that again, but we also need to expose what's going on. A lot of people in the United States are unfamiliar with what's going on in Canada. And by the way, if you don't know, many rail lines in Canada have stopped. Rail workers have been laid off because people are blocking the rail lines in Canada. In Ontario, the Mohawk Nation has taken the lead, but in other cities, just allies are blocking, you know, which is incredible.
Yeah.
And I just heard the Royal Canadian Mounted Police are withdrawing, but their terms to stay out are rather onerous. They want the Wet'suwet'en Nation to give up, basically. Anyway, Monday, 3:30, be there.
Unless you have warrants.
Well, we're not going to get arrested.
I have an announcement.
Yeah.
So on March 7th, we're celebrating International Women's Month. And we're going to have a very special program about Harriet Tubman. We're going to show the movie Harriet. And we're going to have a very good discussion about her life and what wasn't in the movie. And hopefully it will inspire all of us to find our inner Harriet Tubman. So please come
And dinner will be served at 5.
by the men.
Yep.
People won't show up.
It's true though.
Every year for the last 50 years. I have something to.
Yeah.
So we have a new pamphlet out. It's a revised pamphlet, new and revised. The Bloody Hands of U.S. Imperialism in the Middle East. And they're only $3. It's 62 pages. Kind of cool. And so I pass this around. People want to look at it. There are copies in the main bookstore. It's all right, I'll give you it's your copy.
Who's the writer?
Many, right, so it's reprints
okay.
from fightingwords.net
Oh,
and a couple other speeches. No, everything's been on fightingword.net. So Randy Nord's in there, I'm in there. James Carey from Geopolitics Alert. I don't know if you...
PFLP.
Yeah, there's a great, yeah, it features prisons, the Black Liberation Movement, and the struggle for Palestine by the imprisoned General Secretary of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. And that was an introduction he wrote to writings of Huey P. Newton that had been published in France. So this is the English translation. It's kind of cool.
350. I haven't.
Does anybody else have an announcement?
Well, just that we meet every Monday at 7 o'clock here for the Moratorium Now Coalition and the Michigan Emergency Committee Against War and Injustice, and we have a lot of issues we're taking up. May Day is coming up in a couple of months, and we're going to start discussing that as well. The housing crisis is unabated in the city. They just put out a report yesterday that the average rent in Detroit is over $1,000 per month, which, you know, in other cities people say, oh, that's not bad, but here, that's, you know, we're still the poorest city in the United States, and you know, it's just forcing more and more people out of the city. So.
And if I might add,
Mhm.
where else is there affordable
Yeah,
outside the city? Because I came here because
I
I
know.
couldn't afford to live in the suburbs, so
exactly.
where now?
I know they're pushing people to go live. You know, I know people that never would have moved out of the city, but they said they can't afford to pay the rents. And then particularly older people because, you know, they don't have the amenities, you know. So that's what's happening.
Cool. All right, so let's get started with this. I guess I'm going to try to do a quick recap of the first chapter real quick.
Good.
Yeah, so last week we all read together this first chapter, which there's copies over here if anybody wants. It's about 10 pages. And just real quickly, you know, Engels, sorry, he wrote this text. Sorry, I wanted to look up when this was published. (1878). So just to give a little context on that, 1878, and he starts off giving his thesis about a sort of different ideas and conceptions of socialism, a more reason-based concept of socialism versus a more material-based, kind of seeing what's really going on. And he goes into, talks about the French Revolution is a big sort of something in the background of this text, and looking at as that revolution happened, which was a bourgeois revolution, that there was also a sort of a beginning, the burgeoning of proletariat struggle that was sort of contained within that, and some small uprisings of what was sort of a first proletarian uprising against the bourgeoisie, which had just kind of taken power, you know, when capitalism sort of first began. He goes into what he calls the utopian socialists, which is Saint-Simon, Fourier, and Robert Owen, and talks about the various great ideas and some of the great achievements some of the great models that they showed for their early ideas of socialism and early ideas of communism, which are pretty impressive. And I think it's a pretty good portrayal of the good work that they did, but he's kind of starting to work towards a difference between a utopian socialism that he's talking about with them and what he's going to call a scientific socialism. I don't know if I really need to go into any more background of the first chapter than that. Does anybody have anything that they took away from who was here last week that they wanted to throw in about that? Or, yeah.
I think it just was a good analysis of why, like, socialism and revolutionary struggle doesn't exist in a vacuum. And when you think it does, it tends to lead to, like, massive failure. Like, this pure utopian thinking has never succeeded, and I thought Engels hit that pretty square on the head.
Yeah, I mean, anyone else want to throw anything in? Or,
Well,
yeah.
so we define utopian socialism
Mhm.
and scientific socialism in the first chapter, right? So it's basically,
Yeah.
okay, so can you like give a quick
Yeah, I mean,
synopsis of that?
I think that what you'd call scientific socialism really gets its full analysis and a lot more in detail in the third chapter, and that's when you'll really kind of end up with the final picture of what Engels is trying to lay out and put forward as, this is scientific socialism, and it gets into historical materialism, which is the title of the third chapter, and it's kind of the way of thinking about history moving forward towards socialism and how it will really happen based on the material situation of the classes and what's going on with those classes. But he definitely defines utopian socialism really clearly, and it consists of a lot of just like he spends a lot of time early in the chapter talking about French philosophers and how they used reason to sort of come up with a new great idea with which to transform society. And he's definitely rejecting that, saying, it's kind of what a lot of people call the great man theory, or it's an idealist way of looking at the world, which says that the world is, sort of based on ideas that came out of people's heads, and it really didn't make any difference whether somebody came up with socialism today or it could have happened 100 years ago. It was just a random thing that somebody thought of, and boom, we did it based on that, versus the idea that the conditions had to be right for that step to kind of go forward, for history to sort of move into this next phase, and for even the ideas that we have, that these philosophers have, even for them to have those ideas at all. That came from a material basis, not the other way around. So a utopian socialist is sort of using that more like start inside your head approach, and sort of creating ideas, creating models even, maybe sometimes even a really good model that works well, like Robert Owen. He talks about how Robert Owen actually was a factory owner that literally had factories and an entire town that were run in a much more egalitarian way, and even getting to the point where he really was fully criticizing worker exploitation. He kind of had his own Marxian economic analysis of, like, you can make workers' lives as good as possible, but if you're still exploiting their labor, that's still not right, or we still haven't got there. So he was kind of pushing this idea, and you could kind of draw out the full plans and paperwork and say, here's how socialism could work. But that's a plan that's on paper. It was rejected. It wasn't embraced by society at large. In fact, he was seen as, that was too dangerous and too scary. And just simply the great idea didn't really catch on in the way that he kind of expected it to. And somebody who was so beloved sort of became more of a social pariah when he tried to even push that. So it's sort of saying utopian socialists, and I think as we discussed, it's not that he's totally trashing them or saying that they're just totally bad, but just that to think that you can sort of just put out your idea, your vision, and that for that to just catch on is sort of not going to work or whatever. Yeah.
I just wanted to add that it's kind of messed up that he was made into a pariah for that reason, because typically that's how evolution occurs, is by one person coming out with something new. People initially reject it, and then other conditions come into effect that kind of starts to prove what they're saying as tangible and real or possible, and then it's embraced, sometimes too late. So, I mean, and also I think material conditions can create the ideas that people come up with, but I also think that there is an element of something that hasn't been done before coming up, and I mean, like a scientist yelling eureka because he's discovered something that no one else had seen up to that point. That doesn't necessarily have to do with a culmination of everything that he knew before, but it's new. It's great. I mean, that's how evolution happens. All of these things, everything's coming in new. So it doesn't have to be either or.
Yeah.
You know, it's not all based on what you can see, and it's not all based on what you can see. You know, what you can't see and what you can see, those things are mutually.
Yeah, I mean,
they're not mutually exclusive. It's all together.
I think this everything you're talking about is the like the ground of is being covered in this text, and we're actually going to get into it a lot, even just now in the chapter too. And there's a back and forth. This idea of materialism is definitely primary importance to what he's saying. But yeah, we should probably just get into it because it's going to go all towards that. But yeah.
I just wanted to say that he talks a lot about class.
Yeah.
Which, and how these gigantic means of production were just developing, from the manufacturing to industry, and how this bourgeois class was becoming more and more powerful, these gigantic means of production, and the class antagonisms were developing as well. So a lot of, I think, prior writers they were talking about ideas, but not really the antagonism and contradiction between various classes.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's primary. All right, so we should get started. Last time we kind of would do like a paragraph, and maybe this time we could go a little bit more. I'm gonna read like maybe a page and just see where we're at.
Sounds good.
All right. All right, so yeah, it's continuing from the last chapter. So, in the meantime, along with and after the French philosophy of the 18th century, had arisen the new German philosophy, culminating in Hegel. Its greatest merit was the taking up again of dialectics as the highest form of reasoning. The old Greek philosophers were all born natural dialecticians, and Aristotle, the most encyclopedic of them, had already analyzed the most essential forms of dialectic thought. The newer philosophy, on the other hand, although in it also dialectics had brilliant exponents, e.g. Descartes and Spinoza, had, especially through English influence, become more and more rigidly fixed in the so-called metaphysical mode of reasoning, by which also the French of the 18th century were almost wholly dominated, at all events in their special philosophical work. Outside philosophy, in the restricted sense, the French nevertheless produced masterpieces of dialectic. We need only call to mind Diderot's Le Nouveau des Roms. Is anyone a really good French pronouncer here? Because I'm going to butcher the next line.
No problem.
And Rousseau's, I'm going to say this terribly, Discours sur l'origine et le fondement de l'inégalité parmi les hommes.
Woo!
Somebody here is better than me. Somebody here can do that.
You're doing good. You're doing a good job.
All right. Okay, back to it. We give here in brief the essential character of these two modes of thought. When we consider and reflect upon nature at large, or the history of mankind, or our own intellectual activity, at first we see the picture of an endless entanglement of relations and reactions, permutations and combinations, in which nothing remains what, where, and as it was, but everything moves, changes, comes into being, and passes away. We see, therefore, at first the picture as a whole, with its individual parts still more or less kept in the background. We observe the movements, transitions, connections, rather than the things that move, combine, and are connected, rather than the things that move. This primitive, naive, but intrinsically correct conception of the world is that of ancient Greek philosophy, and was first clearly formulated by Heraclitus. Everything is and is not, for everything is fluid and is constantly changing, constantly coming into being and passing away. So just to stop for a moment, he'll begin by saying that he's going to be talking about dialectics. It's the name of the chapter. There's the two forms of thinking, dialectics and metaphysics. He's saying Greeks came up with dialectics way back when, but he's saying that was the first form of dialectics, a naive form, a form where they were seeing the whole picture and they hadn't yet zeroed in on each individual part. So, and then he's going to go into the next. So, but from here, he goes on. But this conception, correctly as it expresses the general character of the picture of the appearances as a whole, does not suffice to explain the details of which this picture is made up. And so long as we do not understand these, we have not a clear idea of the whole picture. In order to understand these details, we must detach them from their natural special causes, effects, etc. This is primarily the task of natural science and historical research, branches of science which the Greek of classical times, on very good grounds, relegated to a subordinate position because they had first of all to collect materials for these scientists to work upon. A certain amount of natural and historical material must be collected before there can be any critical analysis, comparison, and arrangement in classes, orders, and species. The foundations of the exact natural sciences were, therefore, first worked out by the Greeks of the Alexandrian period, and later on, in the Middle Ages, by the Arabs. Real natural science dates from the second half of the 15th century, and thence onward it had advanced with constantly increasing rapidity. The analysis of nature into its individual parts, the grouping of the different natural processes and objects in definite classes, the study of the internal anatomy of organized bodies in their manifold forms. These were the fundamental conditions of the gigantic strides in our knowledge of nature that have been made during the last 400 years. But this method of work has also left us as legacy the habit of observing natural objects and processes in isolation, apart from their connection with the vast whole, of observing them in repose, not in motion, as constraints, not as essentially variables, in their death, not in their life. And when this way of looking at things was transferred by Bacon and Locke from natural science to philosophy, it begot that narrow metaphysical mode of thought peculiar to the last century. So yeah, the next stage after the Greek dialectics is now this metaphysics of, when I was reading that paragraph, in my mind I saw an image of like a butterfly collection, like behind glass, they're pinned to the board and they're dead, and it's like a way that you can study a butterfly, but like you can study it in detail, but you have no idea how it interacts with the world. It's behind glass, it's not alive, so it's like, it was important to do that, to get the specifics, but it's gonna leave you from understanding the picture, so, yeah.
Can we get can someone get, because I like to be clear on defining terms, because so many people and so many things, so many ways people interpret things that we need to know exactly what Engels is talking about when he's talking about dialectics. Mm-hmm. Can you explain what he means by dialectics here?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's going to become more clear as we go on, because that's kind of the point of this whole chapter. But I mean, up until now, he's shown that dialectics is about looking at a whole broad picture and seeing the way that things interact with each other, not just looking at a thing on its own, fixed and rigid and taken out of context, but in context. It's about looking at the movement of things and seeing the forest for the trees, and not missing it by looking too closely at the details. And so that's dialectics. Metaphysics would be the opposite. Metaphysics would be look at something on its own, out of context, So yeah, and then it'll go on to continue about dialectics. So yes.
Oh, I just wanted to mention also, he's beginning to illustrate the relationship between the natural scientific method, what's considered the natural scientific method in the modern period, the last 600 years, and that methodology and its relationship to philosophy and even the social sciences like history, you know, in terms of putting things in categories and examining the categories, but also at the same time looking at the contradictions, you know, within phenomena and the dynamics surrounding those contradictions, which creates a synthesis or creates new developments, you know, in the scientific world, even in terms of social processes and so forth. So, yeah, I think Engels exemplifies, you know, the somewhat merging of the natural scientific mode of thinking and philosophy as well as the social sciences. But he's trying to bring the principles of the natural sciences into the social sciences and into philosophy.
I like
Yeah. Okay, you see, yeah.
I think he's saying that things aren't static.
Yeah, right.
That they're in constant motion and everything's interconnected.
Right.
And then I think later he says that things move from lower to higher, and that everything contains within itself contradiction. And it's that struggle that of change and motion, everything's interconnected, so it's much more complex. And God created the universe, and this is the way it is. He started the clock, and now we just have to live our lives, which was more of a philosophy of feudalism. Because things stayed the same for centuries and centuries and centuries. But now we've got capitalism and this industry developing and science developing. So it's more in tune with that period of history.
Yeah, because like even the notion under that type of thinking of waging a struggle against the powers that be, you know, whether it's the landlords or the royalty, was unthinkable, you know, because this is the way it is. You know, the kings have divine right. They were born to rule, and who are we to question or challenge that, you know? But that was the you know, the dominant thinking, you know, even within
But those contradictions kept popping up.
Yeah, right. Well, people are going to struggle, you know, even if they think like that. They could be put in a social situation where they will rebel and resist, you know, because that's part of humanity. I mean, they will struggle to improve their social conditions. So, yeah.
I mean, I think it's also, if it's a philosophy of feudalism, I think it could also be seen in a lot of ways, I think, as a philosophy of capitalism as well. I mean, if you believe that that is the end of history and that's the way that it's fixed to stay, like Fukuyama point of view maybe, to say like, this is it. This is it. Yeah, that feudalism ended and we got past that, but now this new thing is the end, you know, versus that, no, it's going to keep going, you know. So you could say that I think metaphysical thinking could also apply to capitalism as well.
It permeates even the mass media, you know, if you think about it. And 30 years ago, you know, they were talking about the end of history, because the Soviet Union had collapsed. And then Engels, people like Engels came under attack, you know, in academia by a lot of people, you know.
Still are.
Yeah, they still are attacking us.
That's why they say you can't fight City Hall.
Yeah,
People
it's the same.
say, oh, or I could complain, but it won't do any good anyways.
Okay.
All right. Who wants to read? You do? Cool.
Starting at,
It's the second paragraph on the second page.
and then to what? Good, sir.
As much as you want. I mean, you want to finish the page or maybe the next four paragraphs?
To the metaphysician, things and their mental reflexes, ideas are so isolated, are to be considered one after the other and apart from each other. Are objects of investigation fixed, rigid, given once and for all? He thinks an absolutely irreconcilable antithesis. His communication is yeah, nay, nay, for whatsoever as more cometh of evil. For him, a thing either exists or does not exist. A thing cannot exist at the same time, be itself and something else. positive and negative absolutely exclude one another, cause and effect stand right in rigid antithesis, one to the other. Would want to explain that at all? Is that was kind of
That was a lot right there.
yeah that. I feel like I should stop for a second. Yeah, I didn't understand every word. That
Well, I think he's basically continuing on about metaphysics. He's a little bit repeating to emphasis here. The metaphysician sees things as isolated, rigid, fixed. They don't move. They're let's see what else
Things
does he
exist
say?
in black and white, basically.
Something can't be itself and something else at the same time. That's impossible. So it's a rigid way of thinking. And I think he's just really kind of re-emphasizing the metaphysical view. A thing is fixed the way it is. It doesn't change. I like to talk about like an apple. I don't know where I heard this. I think it was like David Harvey. But like an apple is an apple. If you take a bite out of it, it's not an apple anymore. If it's a seed, then that's not an apple. The tree is not an apple. But the bird that eats this seed that starts the leaves, none of that is an apple. But to a dialectician, all of that is in a sense part of the apple. It's all connected. But the metaphysician would say there's only one thing that is an apple, and it's that one picture in your mind of an apple, and that's it. I don't know. Yeah.
Is there any other definition of metaphysics?
Sharon, I was just looking that up.
Oh,
Okay.
Metaphysics comes from the words meta, meaning beyond,
Mhm.
and physics, meaning the physical world.
Yeah.
So beyond the physical world, and yet everything's isolated and exists in and of
Yeah.
itself statically.
Yeah, I mean,
That's kind of
Well, there's
hypocritical.
Yeah, I see what you're getting at. Yeah.
I think that's where I've been confused with all of this.
Yeah, no, I understand what you're saying. I thought the same thing myself too, actually. Yeah.
Well, I was just gonna say there's like the Marxist metaphysical, like explaining how things exist, explaining the utopian, and then there's like the standard metaphysic in like a scientific or like a physics sense of like you have things that exist in physics and things that are beyond physics. And you talk about like spirituality and things like that. Metaphysics in a Marxist sense just strictly means like something that is unscientific, something that doesn't act within science. So like when you're discussing anarchism or things that people thinking things exist in a vacuum, that is metaphysical, and it's different than like your standard, beyond physics. Like I threw that, but God instructed me to do it. Metaphysics.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But where does the quantum world factor into that? When scientists are saying things like an atom is composed of a nucleus, protons, and electrons that are actually popping in and out of existence at any given moment, and that everything is made of energy, that is a physics point of view that cannot be applied to this theory because it's not being introduced. The only thing that's being addressed is Newtonian physics.
Yeah.
I think that's
I mean,
a
I have a lot of thoughts on all this, and I think one thing is, like as Jackson pointed out, Marxist theory defines metaphysics in the way that we see here, and you'll see that in other Marxist theory. They talk about what is known as the metaphysical view, and it's defined the same way in other Marxist writers. That's one factor to take into account, is that is the definition that they're using. You might say, well, there's a lot of other things that have to do with quantum mechanics or other things in the science. So one thing you could do is just say, well, first of all, that isn't what we're talking about here. But I do think that and I'm not I don't look too deeply into the etymology, but I think it's metaphysics in some sense of what they're talking about here is about sort of abstracting something, right? It's like taking it out of its real material surroundings and coming up with sort of a more abstract, untethered definition of a thing. It's meta, so it's kind of like beyond the physical world in a more abstract sense. And I think, there's a lot of philosophers that have talked about these kinds of ideas of conceiving something in the mind versus like the real experience of it in
But
the world.
everything that was here was once a thought. this was once an idea.
Well, see,
You know what I mean, like-
he would disagree with that, I think, but, that, in this text. But, you know, I think it's a good conversation. You had something you wanted to say.
Yeah, I think for the purposes of what we're saying right now, it probably makes more sense to contrast not dialectics and metaphysics, but metaphysics and materialism.
Thank you. Yeah,
That's
that
probably,
kind of,
yeah,
yeah.
because that kind of gets to what you're saying, because even if you're looking at an atom in like a fixed way, it's like, how is that not? Like, it's still material, because that's not an otherworldly idea. I think you just hit the nail on the head when you're looking at things outside of there. That's where the dialectics aspect of, like, that's what makes dialectical materialism, analyzing that physical atom and how it exists in this whole dialectical, like, interrelationship of other things. I don't know if I just muddied the waters or.
No, you did good.
Okay.
I mean, just because something cannot be physically observed doesn't mean it doesn't exist. You
Well,
can't physically observe a
that
feeling
is-
of love, but it's still there.
I mean, that's
Then you break
something
it down
that,
to,
that's,
you know,
that's a point of
genetic,
view.
Right,
But that's what's being, I think, debated here.
okay.
And, you know, this is a dialectical materialist text, which firmly doesn't root things in the sense of what you were saying, to be honest, in saying that everything that exists was once an idea. That actually was a lot of what the first chapter was
Right,
talking about.
I'll read over that later.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would also say that there's like, once again, like two different meanings to a term here. Like in science, attraction means something entirely different than in common English attraction. And metaphysics and a science, like in a physics sense, means something a lot different than Marxist metaphysics. Like
Okay. I think it's easy
one
to trip
word.
up on that.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
one word that means two different things in two different fields of science.
Okay.
Yeah,
That's
I would
where,
agree.
yeah, that was
Yeah.
the schism that
Yeah.
I was,
Yeah.
I was like, what, how do I resolve this?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean,
Yeah.
probably the best, easiest way to go forward is to understand that this is metaphysics and Marxist theory it means this. You know,
Yeah.
and I think this is actually defining text about that.
Thank you.
Well, maybe after Marx and after Engels, the metaphysics took on a new meaning and a new way of thinking in science. And the word was used differently because this is still the 1800s.
Right.
Yeah,
But
Yeah.
Even thoughts, though, have their basis in the material world. We all came from stars, a
Yes,
physical
well, yeah,
thing.
exactly.
So the thoughts emerged after that.
I see what you're saying.
So there is no
In that
independent
sense,
thought.
that would absolutely be true.
I think we have to look at it in the historical context too, because at this time the Catholic Church was very powerful. And they were the intermediaries between the meta and physics of the world.
Control.
And they're the ones that said,
Of course.
this is what God said, and this is the way it is.
Yeah.
And nothing changes. You come to us, we got the truth, and that's the way it goes down. Whereas my historical materialism would say, well, everything's in a constant state of change, it's interconnected. It goes from it's totally opposite from the concept of religion that they had at that time.
that's simple.
Having-
Yeah.
No, I mean,
oh, no, I didn't, I want to give an example, it may be bad, but, for example, astrology.
Okay.
I mean, that's a metaphysical
Yeah.
system because it makes assumptions about people's personalities just based on when they were born. You know, it doesn't examine the individual per se within a social context, within a material context. You know, for example, if you are a Capricorn, you're supposed to be good at business. Well, you may not be, you know, if you don't have the resources you know, to carry that out. So, you know, I think that's an example of,
Versus
and
like,
people still believe in astrology today. You still got columns in newspapers that have, you know, descriptions on what's going to happen to you this month, you know, based on when you were born and all that. So,
But even astrology,
yeah,
you know, they think it's static, but many
yeah, right.
millions of years from now, the stars won't be in the
In the
same
same
position, so
constellation,
the
yeah,
whole
right.
astrological universe collapses.
Yeah, right. Well, tell them that.
I was about to say, so we say.
David. So I think we should recognize that he attributes to the metaphysicians a lot of the progress in science. Because in the early stages, you had to find us 100 different bugs and look at them and describe them and put them on cases and see how many wings they had and all that. And he says this, the analysis of nature into its individual parts, the groupings of different natural processes, previous paragraph, and objects in different classes, study of internal anatomy. These were fundamental conditions for the giant strides in our knowledge of nature that have been made in the last 400 years. But this method of work has also left us a legacy of the habit of observing natural objects in isolation. And I liked your very first thing. Yeah, you got, before you could understand things about butterflies, you had to study them, see? But then you also had to study caterpillars. And then you had to understand how caterpillars turned into butterflies and the life cycles and what they ate and evolution. So before you could have a dialectical approach, you had to understand, you had to have a lot of basic knowledge.
Right.
So, you know, for all his racism, Linnaeus put all the classifications, phylum, gen, etc., family, etc., genus and species.
Yeah.
No one could try to generalize that until you had a lot of information. A little later, they had discovered, I don't know, about 40 elements and knew a little bit about them, but it took Meyer and Mendeleev, 1869, to put into a periodic table of the element and see that they were somehow related. And it took another 57 years, 58 years, before they understood why they were even related. That's the quantum mechanics and orbitals and things. So it wasn't that, oh, this method of thinking was useless, it just was limited. The other one thing that comes to my mind is that I think it was around 1920, Alfred Wegener, I think he was German, suggested that continents move. And he didn't know how they could do that, but he could see how Africa kind of fit into, or South America fit into Africa, and it took another 50 years or so. When I was in school, they were just starting to recognize continental drift and linking up how the continents had moved, the plates had moved. But that's a dialectical thinking, because they had rejected, no, you can't, continents don't move, how could they even move? And it was rejected. So a lot of the theories are rejected or held back because dialectical thought is not encouraged, or not, I'm not even saying encouraged. I took a lot of science in school. No one talked about metaphysics and dialectics. You just studied what you were studying.
Right.
But if you really want to train somebody, train them a little bit, even the scientists, into having an overview. Nowadays, ecology, things like that are becoming more known, and science itself forces people to look. You know, the stubborn facts of the world around us, as more knowledge is developed, forces us to see that these things are in a relationship, and a changing relationship. And it would have helped a lot over those decades if they didn't reject dialectics because it was linked to communism. Despite all that, it's still the realities are forcing their way.
Hey.
All right, so Jackson.
Now we can move on,
Yeah,
right?
right.
We have
Clear
a-
that up.
It's a good, and it's not that long of a chapter.
No, okay.
At first sight, this mode of thinking seems to us very luminous because it is that of so-called sound common sense. Only sound common sense, respectable fellow that he is, in the homely realm, his four walls, has very wonderful adventures. Directly he ventures out into the wide world of research. And the metaphysical mode of thought, justifiable and necessary as it is, in the number of domains whose extent varies according to the nature of the particular object of investigation, sooner or later reaches a limit, beyond which it becomes one-sided, restricted, abstract, lost in insoluble contradiction. In the contemplation of individual things, it forgets the connection between them. In contemplation of their existence, it forgets the beginning and the end of that existence, of their repose. It forgets their motion and cannot see the woods for the trees. For everyday purpose, we know and say whether an animal is alive or not. But upon closer inquiry, we find that this, in many cases, a very complex question. As the jurists know very well, they have cudgeled their brains in vain to discover a rational limit beyond which the killing of the child in its mother's womb is murder. It is just as impossible to determine the moment of death. For physiological proves, my apologies, proves that the death is not an instantaneous, momentary phenomenon, but a very protracted process.
I just think it's worth noting that Engels has stumbled upon, support for abortion rights here. Like, he's right here saying, like, well, some people believe that life starts here, and he's talking about this in purely philosophical terms. But he's actually just made like a really good case for abortion rights. And it's pretty great. Sorry?
It was a premonition.
Yeah. No, I just think that's very interesting.
He does say earlier that he was the first to declare that in any given society, the degree of woman's emancipation is a natural measure of the general emancipation.
Right, yeah, that was in chapter 1. There's a lot of interesting stuff all embedded here.
What a cool guy.
Yeah. That was, and I think also too, that was him talking about Fourier. So Fourier, I think, may have even done that even beforehand. But yeah, just wanted to point that out.
In like manner, every organized being in every moment, the same and not the same, every moment it assimilates matter supplied from without and gets rid of other matter. Every moment some cells of its body die and others build themselves anew. In a longer or shorter time, the matter of its body is completely renewed and is replaced by the other molecules of matter, so that every organized being is always itself and yet something other than itself. Further, we find upon closer investigation that the two poles of an antithesis. I have a speech impediment, my apologies. Antithesis. I'm skipping it. Positive and negative. I even said it earlier, better, whatever. Positive and negative are as inseparable as they are opposed, and that despite all their opposition, they are mutually interpenetrated. And we find in like manner that cause and effect are conceptions which only hold good in their application to individual cases, but as soon as we consider the individual cases in their general connection with the universe as a whole, they run into each other and they become confound. When we contemplate that the universal action and reaction in which causes and effects are eternal changing places, so that what will be the effect here and now will cause here and there and then and vice versa.
Yeah.
You know, I would say that dialectical thinking is probably more difficult for people. I watched this biography of movie of Louis Pasteur and how difficult it was for all these surgeons to accept his ideas because they couldn't see it. And you know, they would rather see all these sheep die to prove their point. And I think
That sounds familiar.
and I think that, you know, in our society still people have difficulty thinking about, you know, they just want a clear answer. And that's what Trump offers. You know,
Yes.
even though it's all lies, it's a clear answer and they don't have to think about it. It's all there and laid out because thinking is a lot of work. I mean, you know, as you get older, you realize how hard it is. But,
Speak for yourself now.
yes.
It's easier, right?
But I think that's why he's trying so hard to explain this, because he wants to bring people in. At least that's what I think.
On the other hand, the Democrats have a very simple answer. It's the Russians.
Right.
Bernie's a Russian bot, man.
Yeah, come on.
Yes, you're right.
I mean, I really like this chapter.
Yeah.
It's fun, I think, because it's the most philosophical.
And he uses humor.
Yeah, it's a really fun piece of writing. And it's that part where you kind of start to take on a different way of, or you really have to contrast these two ways. It's all about contrasting these two ways of looking at the world. Yeah, I don't know if, Derek?
Yeah, I'll read.
Oh, yeah,
Or
okay,
unless-
great.
unless you want-
Does anybody
No,
else
go
want to
ahead.
talk about the section, or, yeah, we can keep going.
I just have a cold, I want to push it out. None of these processes and modes of thought enter into the framework of metaphysical reasoning. Dialectics, on the other hand, comprehends things and their representations, ideas, and their essential connection, concatenation, motion, origin, and ending. Okay, let me see that again. Dialectics, on the other hand, comprehends things and their representations, ideas, and their essential connection, concatenation, motion, origin, and ending. Such processes as those mentioned above are, therefore, so many corroborations of its own method of procedure. Nature is the proof of dialectics, and it must be said for modern science that it has furnished this proof with very rich materials increasingly daily, and thus has shown that, in the last resort, nature works dialectically and not metaphysically, that she does not move in the eternal oneness of a perpetually recurring cycle, but goes but goes through a real historical evolution. In this connection, Darwin must be named before all others. He dealt the metaphysical conception of nature the heaviest blow by his proof that all organic beings, plants, animals, and man himself are the products of a process of evolution going on through millions of years. But the naturalists who have learned to think dialectically are few and far between. And this conflict of the results of discovery with preconceived modes of thinking explains the endless confusion now reigning in theoretical natural science. The despair of teachers as well as learners, of authors and readers alike. An exact representation of the universe, of its evolution, of the development of mankind, and of the reflection of this evolution in the minds of men can therefore only be obtained by the methods of dialectics with its constant regard to the innumerable actions and reactions of life and death, of progressive or retrogressive changes. And in this spirit, the new German philosophy has worked. Kant began his career by resolving the stable solar system of Newton and its eternal duration, after the famous initial impulse had once been given, into the result of a historical process, the formation of the sun and all the planets out of a rotating nebulous mass. From this, he at the same time drew the conclusion that, given this origin of the solar system, its future death followed of necessity. This theory, half a century later, was established mathematically by Laplace. And half a century after that, the spectroscope proved the existence in space of such incandescent masses of gas in various stages of condensation. Now that was a whole lot. I would have to read that about 10 more times. To get that.
The dictionary.
Yeah, right. So, are we continuing, or, yeah?
We'll discuss that.
Does anybody feel like we should discuss it? Yeah.
I just wanna say, the basis of physics is that energy is neither created nor destroyed. So when we're talking about things beginning and we're talking about things ending, it's really a human, I believe it's really a human construct that we aren't able to see outside of, because when they're examining physics saying that energy is neither created nor destroyed, that means that every time something dies, its energy is living on in some form, which may or may not be physical. I just want to add that.
Well, I mean, there's a lot there to talk about, isn't there? I mean, I think that if you're talking about Kant and him, you know, continuing off of Newton and just proving that the universe was born and that the universe will die, and if you're talking about physics and energy, you know, there's nothing that says that the death of the universe is a finality of everything. You know, I think the idea that that matter is gone forever is not right. It will actually transform into something new, as
Right.
you're saying, and I think that's a pretty
I think
basic
a lot of people
thing.
that's not the follow through thought that they're having when the word death comes into the picture.
Yeah, I mean, I
just wanted to make that clear.
Yeah, I mean, I think that actually goes back right into dialectics once again.
It does.
That says that it's the cyclic, or it's, you know, whatever word, he used the word cyclical earlier,
Cyclical
but
nature.
it's a continuing, evolving process, you know.
I think you
That's
guys
sort
have
of-
a comment.
No, go ahead.
Sort of the theory of revolution, that, you know, the powers that be talk about the status quo, this is it. But the theory of revolution is that everything is changing, there are these contradictions. It's going to evolve into a higher form, and then we can look forward to a better society, which if we look past from slavery to feudalism, serfdom, so that's how we can have as revolutionaries, we can have this confidence that things are moving from a lower to a higher level. And I think the powers that be don't want people thinking that. They want them to think this is going to always be this way.
Yeah.
Take my cue from David there. It's interesting, he talks about the difficulty, the endless confusion now reigning in theoretical natural science, the despair of teachers as well as learners. He's talking about Darwin and evolution. However, that was true for late 1800s. There was a struggle because most scientists were not thinking dialectically. But 100 years more, or now more than 100 years later, the scientific world community is soundly behind the theory of evolution and has grasped it, and it's not even up for discussion. But yet still, evolution is under attack politically, but not by the scientists. And it's because, just what you said, it's a political attack by a ruling class which worries that if you teach students that things can change biologically, systems can be replacing one another, then they might start thinking that they could also change economic systems. And it was a number of years ago, but there was a struggle in the Boston area where Einstein's theory of relativity came under attack. His theory of special relativity, that time is not constant. And it was precisely by the same people who attacked evolution and
Thank you.
biology.
Thank you.
What?
Because that fits in exactly what I was talking about earlier.
Yeah, but it wasn't scientists who were doing this. It was political reactionaries who were worried that, you know, you teach people things can change, they might take it seriously and apply it to dialectical thinking, to history. So, and it's fascinating. Here he's talking about stuff that we know today about galaxies coming into existence, and it's 150 years ago. I mean, Kant was a long time ago. And, but, you know, confirmed also that.
Yeah, I was thinking the question of climate change.
Exactly.
You know, today, you know, most scientists, just about all, recognize, you know, the threat, you know, of climate change. But people like Trump and other political interests attack it daily. So, you know, it's very interesting. You know, he doesn't cite one scientific study or anything, you know.
Well, they don't attack it through science, they attack it politically.
Yeah, they do,
because
yeah, right,
of their-
yeah, I know.
their views.
Yeah.
I wanted to mention the hypocrisy of basing a theory upon Darwin, like as in survival of the fittest, because although it's reflected in nature, it is that survival of the fittest term has been blown out of
Yeah.
proportion and
Social
used to
Darwinism.
commit all sorts of evil in our society that otherwise would not be. It's been twisted and distorted. And I think in order really to understand this, you kind of have to read Darwin, because if you read his book on species, he says survival of the fittest one time, and he says the word love like 100 times in the same text. So it just tells you how easily something can be cherry-picked out of one thing, twisted, and then theories put upon that, and then you have to wonder if there's a schism, is it in the theory itself, or is it in what the theory is
interpretation.
based on? Thank you. Yeah, I want to add that.
I think that's a great point. Yeah.
There's a great quote by Darwin that says, it's not the smartest or the strongest that survive, it's the most adaptable.
Thank you. And that's evolution in a nutshell.
All right. Should we keep going?
Yes.
All right. What is it? The last paragraph on this page?
Hegel.
All right. Who wants to
I
read?
can
Okay.
Okay, this new German philosophy culminated in the Hegelian system. In this system, and herein is its great merit, for the first time, the whole world, natural, historical, intellectual, is represented as a process, that is, as in constant motion, change, transformation, development, and the attempt is made to trace out the internal connection that makes a continuous whole of all this movement and development. From this point of view, the history of humanity no longer appeared as a wild whirl of senseless deeds of violence, all equally condemnable at the judgment seat of mature philosophic reason, and which are best forgotten as quickly as possible, but as the process of evolution of humanity itself. It was now the task of the intellect to follow the gradual march of this process through all of its devious ways, and to trace out the inner law running through all of its apparently accidental phenomena. That the Hegelian system did not solve the problem it propounded is here immaterial. Its epoch-making merit was that it propounded the problem. This problem is one that no single individual will ever be able to solve. Although Hegel was, with Saint-Simon, the most encyclopedic mind of his time, yet he was limited, first, by the necessary limited extent of his own knowledge, and second, by the limited extent and depth of the knowledge and conception of his age. To these limits, a third must be added. Hegel was an idealist. To him, the thoughts within his brain were not the more or less abstract pictures of actual things and processes, but conversely, the things and their evolution were only the realized pictures of the, quote, idea, unquote, existing somewhere from eternity before the world was. This way of thinking turned everything upside down and completely reversed the actual connection of things in the world. Correctly and ingeniously, as many groups of facts were grasped by Hegel, yet for the reasons just given, there's much that is botched, artificial, labored, and a word wrong in point of detail. The Hegelian system in itself was a colossal miscarriage, but it was also the last of its kind. It was suffering, in fact, from internal and incurable contradiction. Upon the one hand, its essential proposition was the conception that human history is a process of evolution, which by its very nature cannot find its intellectual final term in a discovery of any so-called absolute truth. But on the other hand, it laid claim to being the very essence of this absolute truth, a system of natural and historical knowledge, embracing everything, and final for all time. It is a contradiction to the fundamental law of dialectic reasoning. This law indeed by no means excludes, but on the contrary, includes the idea that the systematic knowledge of the external universe can make giant strides from age to age.
Okay. I was just gonna say, I feel
Go
like
ahead.
there's a ton there.
It
I don't know
is,
if anyone
yeah.
else feels that way. I feel like maybe we should stop
Definitely, yeah.
at that point and start to talk about it a little bit, but yeah.
The paragraph where he discusses the Hegelian system is exactly why I was saying it's probably better to contrast materialism and metaphysics as opposed to dialectics and metaphysics, because dialectics
Yeah.
itself can be metaphysical.
Without materialism.
I was gonna
Yeah,
say,
right,
to
yeah.
me, that feels like a spirituality,
Yeah.
because I knew this before I ever knew any of you, or what
Right.
dialectic was, or any of that, and I've seen it and felt it unfolding in my life, and yet that's been a very spiritual process for me.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah,
I've
there's so
can I add
much.
something else? There's the bit about Hegel and the idea, and it kind of reminds me of what we said, like what you mentioned earlier about like the table. Like there's this Plato had this idea that that there's two realms, the physical world and this like
Yes.
this other world where the perfect ideal of
The
everything exists.
Republic, if anybody's read that, kind of embodies that, and that's why it's famous, and if you don't wanna read it, there's awesome videos on YouTube that break it all down.
We brought up the table, and you know, it's like people had the idea for the table, but materially there was like the need to like
Well, then
to
necessity.
do stuff with the table,
Yeah.
and you know, like for Hegel, I guess there's like the idea of like the perfect. Or Plato had the idea of like a perfect table that just exists in the that we're trying to recreate the idea of the perfect table. I guess I don't know if I've never actually read Hegel myself. I don't know if anybody here has, but I've only ever like get reference to him through Marxist literature. Is that what like explicitly what Hegel borrows from, like the Platonic ideal of? To talk about borrowing from Greek philosophy, like the idea of the dialectic to begin with. So I guess it would stand to reason that Hegel would be borrowing from that, but I don't know.
I think I definitely have encountered this sort of body of thought here, and had someone else talk about Plato and his. And I think I was trying to think of that earlier when I was talking about the apple, because I think that's where another example of the same thing, the table that you were talking about. So I've heard the two used in the same sort of space before somewhere, but.
I would also say like Hegel's kind of similar to Kierkegaard in the sense of, or I probably butchered the pronunciation because I don't speak Danish.
Yeah.
But
Understood.
they're kind of very similar in how they come up with their thought process. Is Hegel was like an devout Christian, and so a lot of his thinking of how things unfolded was unfolding like through God, and dialectics existing like through God. So they're kind of very similar in like their basis, and I would compare him more to Kierkegaard, yet having this dialectical view come from the Greek classics, but how he comes about it is like a very, very different kind of way, if you get what I mean.
Sure.
Yeah, David.
Yeah, so, and Marx actually says somewhere that you might as well call the idea that's manifesting itself in history God, if you're gonna say, I mean, at the one hand, Hegel is saying, well, we're gonna analyze very concretely historical development, evolution, all this stuff, really good, except that all of this that you find is the manifestation or emergence of this idea, perfect idea in history, that's moving towards this ideal of some sort. And that's why Marx says it's an abomination, or it's all on its head. Because either you're dialectics and just studying what's actually happening, or it's got some ideal. And it can't be both. And this was, if you read Marx and Engels' letters and their youthful writings, they were really excited when they figured this out. When they figured this out, it's sort of like solved the whole problem. And I think one of the pamphlets is called Feuerbach and the End of German Classical Ideology. It's almost like the end of ideology. You don't need philosophy anymore because we got it now.
I think that this thing that's being described of everything is in constant flux, there are changes and adaptations and mutations, evolution has made leaps that cannot be explained. I don't buy this, that it's either or, even dialectical versus the non-physical, because if you look at quantum physics, they do these studies where a particle is either a solid or a particle is a wave. And the observation of that is ultimately what ends up determining what that is. So our very observation of reality changes reality. And how does this fit into dialectical materialism, which is based on 1800s science? I just wanted to add that because this is what all this is coming towards. If you think about somebody and they call you, if you're about to buy a red Honda and you're thinking about it, and all of a sudden you see red Hondas all, I mean, there's experiences in our lives, coincidences, things that line up that science, Newtonian science cannot explain, and yet that's true for us, and that's true in our experience. And our experience is what we're coming from, and no one else. You know, if you were Moses on the mount, to him that was a very real thing to him because he experienced that, and then the validity of that was his experience. So it really is. It's kind of like this double bind kind of thing. But I just wanted to throw that out there because there's these. It's like there's this separation between all of this, but yet we're talking about how everything is connected. Everything.
Yeah.
So.
I mean, yeah, I have, I mean, I think this is the debate that is sort of around this idea. I mean, last week I said, I didn't really intro it this way this week, but the understanding the text that's here is, what he's saying is firmly, he's going towards dialectical materialism. There is an opposing point of view, and he actually, in my opinion, he does kind of clinch it in this middle paragraph here. It's the shorter one, where, and I think, Tom, you would agree with me here that like the way I took away from this text, it's like you've got metaphysics and dialectics, and you've got idealism and materialism. To me, my interpretation of what he's saying in this part is to say that basically, if you are a dialectician, then you must be a materialist. That is, they go together. You could have, another combination. You could have metaphysical materialism, which I think he mentioned somewhere in here, and you could have a dialectical idealist, which is what Hegel is. That's what he's saying. But what he's saying is that basically, you could also have metaphysical idealism, which would be the full opposite of everything he's talking about. But I think what my interpretation of what Engels is saying, just to put it out there, and then we can debate it, or even debate if that's what he is saying. But essentially what he's saying is metaphysical materialism and dialectical idealism, those, first of all, they don't even make any sense at all. So just get rid of those completely. Dialectical materialism makes sense, and metaphysical idealism makes sense, but metaphysical idealism is wrong.
And
so
yet
the outcome
is based on contradiction itself.
That's what's dialectical.
Yeah.
That is dialectical. Yeah.
I think we have to be careful with the analogies with physics, because quantum mechanics cannot explain why this drops to the ground when I let it go. So Newtonian mechanics.
Oh, it's important.
No, but it's right. Newtonian mechanics is right. It depends on what level you're looking at. And also, pardon me?
More general relativity.
Right. There's an area where different aspects of physics prevail. Physicists are even now debating, when did the laws of physics get created? Okay? Because they aren't even stable. Okay? So energy and mass, you say, can't be created and destroyed, but they did get created at the beginning of the universe. And they will disappear at the end of the universe. So we have to be careful with these analogies of physics.
So some think.
Or also, we know so far, right?
Sharon, you had your hand up before. I jumped
Well,
in.
that's okay, it's gone.
Okay,
I'm sorry. But what else? I mean, I feel like this is really the kernel of the whole thing.
It is.
You know, and there's more obviously, but like we're fully into it at this point. I mean, I thought that again, just not to overemphasize it, but at the middle of this page, you know, he gets to the point where he's saying, and like you were really hitting on this earlier, is that he's getting to this point. I think you were anyway. I think this is what you were getting to, is that it's like I feel like I need to go back and look at it again, but when he's talking about absolute truth. On the other hand, it laid claim to being the very essence of this absolute truth, a system of natural and historical knowledge, embracing everything and final for all time. You know, this idealism, that, and what he's saying, God, like you said, that what else would you call it really? An eternal, ultimate truth that was before anything ever existed and after everything's gone. Idealism, right? That it's a contradiction to the, he's saying, you know, we have to understand what Hegel, or what Engels is saying. You might disagree with it, but what he's saying here is that contradicts dialectics. So being a dialectical ideal, sorry?
Hegel's dialect.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think he calls Hegel a colossal miscarriage. You know, he's saying, and it's funny because he rejects the concept of trashing everything that came before as wrong, and he calls that metaphysical thinking. But he is basically, he's also, on the other hand, he's saying, you know, Hegel had it backwards. Yeah. That those two things don't go together. Dialectics and idealism, that it doesn't really work if you really apply one to the other. It's a contradiction, or you know, it doesn't make sense. So, you know, this is really the nugget, the kernel of his theory here, and it's dialectical materialism. So I think it's an important thing to talk about for a little while.
Real quick, I think it was Lenin who said that Marx took Engels' kernel of truth, being the dialectical process, and flipped that on its head with adding the materialist aspect to it. But I never heard that. It was a good point. I never heard that before. Like that even the idea of the ideal is like flies in the face of dialectics itself. I never really considered that aspect of it myself. Yeah, makes sense.
Somebody got a bunch. Yeah, I mean, I didn't get that out of this until the second time I read it. Yeah. To be honest. Yeah. I think he's pretty much saying that if you have these two dualities, you know, there's really only one outcome out of them. That there's two combinations that make sense that are fully opposed, and he's rejecting what would it be? It would be a metaphysical idealism. You know, he's saying the other two literally are nonsensical, and then this one is right and that one is wrong. You know, so it's I think that's what he's doing. You know? And then that can be debated. You know, but I think a Marxist analysis is to agree with that essentially.
Continue?
Yeah.
Okay. The perception of the fundamental contradiction in German idealism led necessarily back to materialism, but nota bene, not only to the simple metaphysical, exclusively mechanical materialism of the 18th century. Old materialism looked upon all previous history as a crude heap of irrationality and violence. Modern materialism sees in it the process of evolution of humanity and aims at discovering the laws thereof. With the French of the 18th century, and even with Hegel, the conceptions obtained of nature as a whole, moving in narrow circles and forever immutable, with its eternal celestial bodies as Newton, the unalterable organic species as Linnaeus taught. Modern materialism embraces the more recent discovery of natural science, according to which nature also has its history in time. The celestial bodies, like the organic species, that under favorable conditions, people them being born and perishing. And even if nature as a whole must still be said to move in recurrent cycles, these cycles assume infinitely larger dimensions. In both aspects, modern materialism is essentially dialectic and no longer requires the assistance of that sort of philosophy which Queenlight pretended to rule the remaining mob of sciences. As soon as each special science is bound to make clear its position in the great totality of things and of our knowledge of things, a special science dealing with this totality is superfluous or unnecessary. That which still survives of all earlier philosophy is the science of thought and its law, formal logic and dialectics. Everything else is subsumed in the positive science of nature and history. Whilst, however, the revolution in the conception of nature could only be made in proportion to the corresponding positive materials furnished by research, already much earlier certain historical facts that had occurred, which led to a decisive change in the conception of history. In 1831, the first working class rising took place in Lyons. Between 1838 and 1842, the first national working class movement, that of the English Chartists, reached its height. The class struggle between proletariat and bourgeoisie came to the front in the history of the most advanced countries in Europe, in proportion to the development, upon the one hand, of modern industry, upon the other, of the newly acquired political supremacy of the bourgeoisie. Facts more and more strenuously gave the lie to the teachings of bourgeois economy as to the identity of the interests of capital and labor, as to the universal harmony and universal prosperity that would be the consequence of unbridled competition. All these things could no longer be ignored, any more than the French and the English socialism, which was their theoretical, though very imperfect expression. But the old idealist conception of history, which was not yet dislodged, knew nothing of class struggles based upon economic interests, knew nothing of economic interests. Production and all economic relations appeared in it only as incidental, subordinate elements in the quote, history of civilization, unquote. So this is a pretty profound paragraph. Well, I mean, he's saying, he's starting to provide the elements of scientific socialism, saying, the working class movement evolved in historical stages, but it cannot be explained in the idealistic conception of history. Even from a materialist perspective, it's still idealism because it's not taking into consideration what are the motive forces of history and social transformation. So other people can comment on that. Sounds pretty heavy. Go ahead.
I don't really get this sentence here. Facts more and more strenuously gave the lie to the teachings of bougie economy as the identity of the interest of capital and labor, as the universal harmony and universal prosperity that will be the consequence of unbridled competition. Is universal harmony and universal prosperity, how do those relate to unbridled competition?
The last paragraph.
Where you at the last paragraph?
In the
In the
dead
middle of the
middle
one
of the
that was just-
paragraph,
Okay.
on 5. Are you saying like you don't understand yeah, I mean, he's
Critiquing.
yeah, I mean he's
Like you hear Trump say, "Oh yeah, America's doing better than it's ever done. Unemployment is lower. And so therefore there's this
Oh, I
compatibility
see what you're
between
saying.
unbridled capital
That's the lie.
and the welfare of labor."
yeah, it's a lie that
Okay.
unbridled
Okay.
competition will
Because I'm like,
bring.
universal harmony and
Yeah.
universal prosperity.
So
sounds
he's
pretty
being
good to me.
sarcastic in a way.
Yeah, he's
Okay.
saying that
Yeah.
that's not brought by unbridled
Gotcha.
competition. And
Yeah.
the facts, as they continue to come out, are proving that it's wrong
Okay.
as it goes on.
But it is true that the ruling class today continues to push this
They do.
line.
They
Yeah,
do.
they do,
Trump is a
absolutely.
I mean, it's not just Trump, it's
Yeah,
the
no.
whole establishment pushes this thing that, this is the only way we can have peace and harmony.
Yeah.
Or universal peace and harmony, is have cutthroat competition where we kill each other.
Which is
Yeah,
also
right.
based on the survival of the fittest concept, like
Yeah,
I was
that's-
talking about earlier.
Yeah.
It's like an excuse that they use to
Social
push their own
Darwinism.
agenda.
Yeah.
Yeah, very true.
Also, I think going back to chapter 1 again, it says the representatives of the bourgeoisie put themselves forward as representing not one special class, of the whole of
Yeah.
suffering humanity.
Yeah.
So there's no real contradiction between the
Workers.
bourgeoisie and the
Yeah.
workers.
Yeah.
You know, they're the ones who, with this unbridled competition, are making the world better.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, he says here they know nothing of class struggles based on economic interests.
Yeah.
Know nothing of economic interests. They don't
Yeah.
even acknowledge
Yeah,
that.
right.
They don't look at class.
If I say it doesn't exist, then it doesn't.
They're saying it doesn't.
Right.
I would disagree a little bit with that this is sarcastic. The feeling was, not by Engels and Marx, but the feelings were when the bourgeoisie led the mass of the peasantry and workers, who did the bulk of the fighting, against the nobility, for instance, in France, in the French Revolution. There was this whole thing of fraternity, equality, and so it really was in people's mind. And then, you know, people were leaving the farms, coming to the cities, and entering into these factories, and the maybe propaganda, but maybe even the bourgeoisie believed, well, it'll be prosperity, we'll get rich, everyone else, or you'll get jobs, and I don't think they're being sarcastic. I think that was the sentiment at the beginning, but it soon evolved, or could be seen by the workers and the peasants, that this wasn't happening and wouldn't happen. But the Saint-Simon, Fourier, and Owen emerged at a period before the class struggle was intense, but when the first problems were being sharply perceived. They could see the poverty and the exploitation and the ill health and the child labor. And they put forward, well, gee, we have this giant machinery, we've got all these new capitalists, and we all just fought in the revolution together. Why can't we have a society that looks like this and this, and laid out all these wonderful plans? Quite amazing if you read in some of the original material. Because they were still thinking that we could transition to that somehow by just listen to good ideas, my good ideas. I'm Fourier and I have this great, does this make sense to you? And they went to rich people and showed them their plans, and maybe they got some funds even, you know, not enough, it's whatever. But anyway, but clearly, you know, uprisings began, and then the Chartists was the real key. I mean, the French Revolution showed the emergence of the capitalist system, or the bourgeoisie, but it was the Chartists that showed the emergence of the working class as a class. And that couldn't have been just imagined by someone 30, 40 years earlier. It was not imagined. But now it was in front of you, you could see it.
I think the social democrats today are like that.
Yeah, a lot of
They
them
say
are.
if we just fine tune this system, you know, it's gonna be all right.
Yeah, this was written too, just a few decades before the rise of monopoly capitalism and the primacy of banks over the whole system. And I don't think anyone could have seen this coming. You know, I think the first big bank that issued bonds and all that in the United States, wasn't that during the Civil War? It was the Charles something Bank, and it collapsed shortly thereafter. But I don't think anyone could imagine that 2 or 3 companies could dominate a whole industry.
I disagree.
Back then they could. It hadn't happened
There's a
yet.
direct quote by Jefferson that talks about banking and being left penniless.
But it hadn't happened.
Booted off the
It
land.
hadn't happened yet. Lenin wrote about this at the turn of the century.
Oh, gotcha.
Yeah, after it actually happened. I think I actually think people were honest. They thought they could head this off. They thought they could build a better world. But then, you know, hell broke loose.
Well, the contradictions of capitalism happen.
Dialectically.
Exactly.
Wait, there was one other thing that I was thinking about. Oh, I think you made a good point. Somebody said, I think David, you said, or Mike, you said earlier that, like, well, they're still saying that, right? They're still saying that prosperity comes out of competition, whatever. And also, clearly, people are still saying, like David was just saying, well, gee, we have this big whole system, like we have all these things, couldn't we rearrange them in a way that would work better? Couldn't we just, wouldn't it be a good idea if we kind of did it this way instead of that way? That would be nice for all the people, wouldn't it? You know, I mean, I think people are doing that a lot now still, and I think that was one of the reasons I thought this is still relevant to read, for sure. You know, thinking about it in a more utopian way, you know, is a thing that still happens all the time.
That's just like what Dave was saying, the social democrats are saying.
Yeah, exactly. That's
Framing
why, yeah,
things just
completely
like
to
that.
your point. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I would even say like a lot of propaganda that you see coming out of these social democratic circles. Like I think DSA made a big propaganda of like showing how diverse they were in like a cartoon or something like that.
Talk to the group.
And they made like this animated presentation thing to like a poster to put out and send out for people to put up. And who was the different occupations they put on there? Well, you know, they had, you know, plumbers and things like that, but in the back they put police officer, military soldier, and like white collar workers. And just as a big like, oh yeah, let's all come together. We don't care if you're in the police, come join DSA. And I was like, well, this is very emblematic of what they think their movement is. It's like social democrats thinking we can all go kumbaya on the street and boom, our problem is solved. And I think that's very emblematic of what he's talking about with idealists and utopians is they think the end goal is just all of us holding hands and cheering and then things are fixed when that isn't the case and things have to progress dialectically. Things have to fundamentally change over time. Nothing's just going to change by all of us, you know, having a smoke sesh in the street.
All right. Who wants to read? Okay. Where did we?
Halfway.
Yeah, the new facts.
The new facts made imperative a new examination of all past history. Then it was seen that all past history, with the exception of its primitive stages, was the history of class struggles. That these warring classes of society are always the products of the modes of production and of exchange, any word of the economic conditions of their time. That the economic structure of society always furnishes the real basis, starting from which we can alone work out the ultimate explanation of the whole superstructure of juridical and political institutions, as well as of the religious, philosophical, and other ideas of the given historical period. Hegel has freed history from metaphysics. He made it dialectic, but his conception of history was essentially idealistic. And now idealism was driven from its last refuge, the philosophy of history. Now a materialistic treatment of history was propounded, and a method found of explaining man's knowing by his being, instead of, as heretofore, his being by his knowing. From that time forward, socialism was no longer an accidental discovery of this or that ingenious brain, but the necessary outcome of the struggle between two historically developed classes, the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. Its task was no longer to manufacture a system of society as perfect as possible, but to examine the historical economic succession of events from which these classes and their antagonism had of necessity sprung, and to discover in the economic conditions thus created the means of ending the conflict. But the socialism of earlier days was as incompatible with this materialistic conception as the conception of nature and of the French materialists was with dialectics and modern natural science. The socialism of earlier days certainly criticized the existing capitalistic mode of production and its consequences, but it could not explain them and therefore could not get the mastery of them. It could only simply reject them as bad. More strongly, this earlier socialism denounced the exploitations of the working class, inevitable under capitalism. The less able it was it clearly to show in what this exploitation consisted and how it arose, but for this it was necessary to present the capitalistic mode of production in its historical connection and its inevitableness during a particular historical period, and therefore also to present its inevitable downfall, and to lay bare its essential character, which was still a secret. This was done by the discovery of surplus value. It was shown that the appropriation of unpaid labor is the basis of the capitalist mode of production and of the exploitation of the worker that occurs under it. That even if the capitalist buys the labor power of his laborer at its full value as a commodity on the market, He yet extracts more value from it than he paid for, and that in the ultimate analysis, this surplus value forms those sums of value from which are heaped up constantly increasing masses of capital in the hands of the possessing classes. The genesis of capitalist production and the production of capital were both explained. These two great discoveries, the materialistic conception of history and the revelation of the secret of capitalistic production through surplus value, we owe to Marx. With these discoveries, socialism became a science. The next thing was to work out all its details and relations.
I just want to say that I was thinking that, capitalism really creates greed in a personality, and it creates all kinds of nasty things. And I was thinking of Cuba. And Cuba has been around long enough now to know that, I haven't been, but I've heard that people there are very different. They share and they work together, and there's a different atmosphere. All right, and if you took away the embargo, I don't know if greed would have developed if they had more things. I don't know the answer to that. But socialism seems to create more of a person that's more interested in things. I think everybody in this room cares about equality, justice, and caring about your fellow man, rather than being at the top. And I think, I don't know, that's what I get out of this. So that's all.
Yeah, just to comment to what you just said, a few pages back, he says, I'll just read a couple sentences. This new German philosophy culminated in the Hegelian system. In this system, inherent in its great merit, for the first time in the world, natural, historical, intellectual is represented as a process. Well, so from this point of view, the history of mankind does no longer appear as a wild world of senseless deeds of violence, all equally condemnable at the judgment seat of mature philosophic reason, and which are best forgotten as quickly as possible, but the process of evolution of man itself, or himself. It was now the task of either way, but the whole point is that, I guess what you were saying earlier is people correspond to the world in which they live, and it's not just people are bad, people are greedy, people, I think you brought up a contrast that makes sense. It's like, if socialism as like a material system breeds a different sort of person. And I think one thing that people debate all the time is like, what is human nature? I guess a human acts one way in a particular circumstance and another in another set of circumstances. But I guess that's a dialectical idea itself. But anyway, it just reminded me of what you said, that's all.
But under capitalist theory and philosophy, human beings are inherently individualistic, greedy. So it's a different approach, to human nature, in that sense. Which feeds into the conservative view of history too. That
it's like Hegel's ideas.
The world cannot change because people will not change.
People suck.
Also that production is social. So in actual fact, we are social beings, and it's said that we are hardwired to be cooperative.
Mm-hmm.
Because we couldn't create any of this without cooperating with one another.
Right.
It's just the fact that we have this private property that makes the at this stage of our evolution, that causes these antagonisms and contradictions. It's not that that's part of us. It's just the relations of production which cause these antagonisms, and if the relations of production change, where things are owned cooperative or cooperative socially, just like production is social, and that contradiction is it's gone, then why the hell would we want to fight with each other? We got everything we need.
Yeah.
Right.
I have a little different take on it. I remember being 13 years old and reading Atlas Shrugged. And I don't know how many of you guys have read that or are familiar with Ayn Rand's philosophies. I know. Go ahead, laugh. However, the premise of a person's work being their honor, the premise of doing your best, caring about the product that you are creating, and wanting to not only be able to take pride in that, but to not feel as though it has to be scattered to the wind to everyone else if you're the one that came up with it. I really think that is key in some of this, because it's not just about commodification from, you know, a human labor into, you know, capital and product. It has to do with power and control, and where are you sourcing what you're getting, and is it being sourced in a sustainable way, or is it being sourced in an unsustainable way? And I like the idea of cooperation, and literally what Dave is saying is very true, because on a scientific level it has been proven that our brains are hardwired, and we are hardwired for cooperation. And there is such a thing as it's called the vagus nerve, and it's in the brain, and so when you see somebody getting hurt, or, you know, ouch, you know, it's like it's a resonation with someone else's pain, the ability to be compassionate, the ability to be empathetic, and this commodification of humanity and this materialism has taken that away from people. They have proof that the richer you become, the more apathetic you become, and the less you feel for humanity itself. Now, to me, that's the crux right there, because all of us should have enough to get by. And when you're talking about private property versus everything, everybody owns everything, there's still lines to be drawn there, because everyone should have their own private space. Everyone should have a place where they can feel that they can be themselves without being judged, harassed, or imposed upon by everyone else in society. And so these extremes of it has to all be owned collectively versus it has to be all owned privately, I don't think these things need to be mutually exclusive. I just think that there needs to be more development when it comes to those kind of things, because these things are not, if everything was based on need, and I've seen this, and the ideal of it is sound, because you want to take care of your seniors, you want to take care of your vulnerable people, you want to take care of the people in society that can be stepped on and abused the most. However, if everything was based on need, then everyone's weaknesses could become their strengths. I'm sick, therefore you have to give me. I can't, therefore you have to, you know what I'm saying? So these are these forces that are coming out in society, and this is why people who have wealth are afraid of people who are poor or needy, and why there's all this pushing against. Because when it comes down to it, we all do want to cooperate, and we all do agree that old people should be taken care of, or you know, children should always have warmth and food and shelter, and that you don't have to necessarily work for what you get in order to have the basics of what you need. So I just wanted to add that, because it's a complex thing, but there's connections here that have not yet been made.
Okay, Sharon.
I just saw Ayn Rand, Atlas Shrugged on TV. And, you know, I thought, this is not what she's really talking about. You know, it was romanticized. She was in Russia, and everything was taken away, and she was very angry, at what they were doing there. And I don't think that socialism takes away from one's product and one's integrity of one's product. I think that was a misrepresentation. I think she misrepresented that. Because in socialism, you know, even in Nicaragua, I remember when the revolution happened, the arts were really celebrated. Everybody could go to the ballet, like, you know, for $1 or whatever, because they wanted everybody to have these experiences. So I think Ayn Rand and that whole philosophy doesn't really stand on its own.
Oh, no, I agree.
I think people do take pride in what they're doing, and I think socialism doesn't take that away.
And even her, she had to collect Social Security.
Yes.
And then also to say, I wanted to bring up that her family were like rich landowners, and then the only reason why she was able to get educated was because the Soviets allowed women to finally go to university, and that's where she gained all of her philosophical knowledge, was due to the Soviet Union having a guaranteed right to housing. And then what you were also saying earlier with everything being collectivized is, no one's saying they want to go and steal your toothbrush under socialism. Like, what's actually, there's a fundamental difference between personal property and private property, and capitalists really like to lump them together and say,
Exactly, that's what I'm
yeah.
saying, there's
Yeah.
this like misunderstanding where the average person doesn't have that,
Yeah.
that awareness,
In
like
the-
everyone in this room does.
Under socialism, like in Cuba, everyone has a right to a house, everyone has a right to healthcare, everyone has a right to a job, and nobody, the state isn't kicking down the door going, give us everything you own. Like, people have fundamental rights to these things, and these aren't going to like change. Even under socialism, it's just the simple fact of, these ultra-rich people are going to lose their right to be ultra-rich and make money off the backs of the exploited. I think that's like the fundamental thing there.
I think when we say private property, for the purposes of this discussion, we mean that property which produces the wealth, the means of production. That's what we mean here.
The
everything.
wheel that spins the straw into gold.
Well, like, the automotive line
Right.
is, it's
You know,
private property.
Look who led the way in fighting against foreclosures here, the communists in the city
Yeah.
of Detroit. We were defending the individual's right to private
Mhm.
property against the banks.
Against
Right.
finance capital.
Yes, so.
I know, what I'm just saying is who draws that line? Who says what's enough?
We do. The working class. We will make that decision.
And now,
Can I answer that, Rick?
Yeah.
well, not even just that, it's like what you said, it's that which produces wealth itself. It's like under capitalism, a house can only be produced, like, if a house is a commodity, that's the only way it can, like through speculation, money can be made and stuff on it. But private property really, it just refers to the things that generate wealth. And just like the final, like in your big thing that you said, it kind of touched on a lot of the things that, like, fundamentally what this whole pamphlet is about, especially in the last paragraph. It was shown that the appropriation of unpaid labor is the basis of the capitalist mode of production and the exploitation of the worker that occurs under it. That even if the capitalist buys the labor power of his own labor at full value as a commodity on the market, he extracts more value from it than he paid for. And at the ultimate analysis, this surplus value forms the sums of value. I guess that the one thing that we said in the very opening of the reading is that, like, there's these ideas of, like, and this goes to, like, when you were saying, like, if everything's on a need basis. When we were saying, like, in the very beginning, how it's not just, like, some idea that's going to, like, if we do things this way, everybody can be satisfied. It's sort of, this whole thing is a material, looking at what is the material basis of cooperation. Like, like how we're saying we're hardwired to be cooperative. Even that can be argued that came from a hunter-gatherer time. We developed over a period of time where, in order for the group to survive, we have to be cooperative. So that's like even the material basis of this way that we still are inclined to act now. Even that's born in material.
Genetic.
Yeah, I mean that gene had to develop over time under certain conditions, and those conditions, like you were saying about like empathy and stuff. There was once a time where bands of 30 people are like surviving in the woods. If one person's hurt, that lowers all of our chances of living. Whereas now it's almost like you can steal from him, and like we're inclined more now because of the material circumstances to take advantage of the person that's hurt.
Right.
But I think everything that you were saying, it's like, I don't know, it's sort of like everything that we were reading is like woven into it in a way.
I just really want to get this, I really do. And there's something there that is creating the separation between people who think like this and people who think that capitalism's awesome and that this is evil.
I mean, I think there's some muddled things in what you were describing before, the way you were talking about it, I think a little bit by its nature, there were some conflicting ideas there. There's like you just said, the soundness of this versus something else that just doesn't quite seem to sit right. But when you're talking about, it's interesting when you're talking about things like the product of your work, the product of your labor being scattered away. I mean, there's a lot that socialism speaks to that. You know, I mean, that's actually you can look at that notion through the lens of socialism, and it's something that is of the most primary importance in socialism. The concept of the product of your labor as a worker being taken from you. You know, it's individual ownership of the socially produced commodities. I mean, I think that speaks to what you're saying, but it kind of gets turned around on its head when you think about it from the other point of view. You say, well, kind of collective ownership of everything. I'm not going to have, you know, what I currently have, but it's defined as what creates the wealth in society versus a thing that you use, like your toothbrush or your house, you know,
So,
personal property.
something like Stalin or Mao, or it's like anything that, say, somebody who sees capitalism that way would consider to be evil. So the perpetration of that in history there was an error in that, but not in the ideal of that.
Well, it's debated.
David?
Yeah,
And I even went in-
that opens up a whole nother.
Yeah.
Okay.
And what we've been taught about those people is not necessarily true.
Right.
But I think the property that has a social character should be owned socially.
The property that has a social
For example,
character.
a
That's a good way to put it.
factory has a social character. All of us are working together to create wealth. So it shouldn't just be owned by Henry Ford.
Right.
It should be owned by us. The property that, you know, is personal, for example, our home or the things that we have, you know, has a personal character. It's our property. It doesn't have a social character like that. And also, I think that we have to recognize that the capitalism has sort of completed itself
Yeah.
in terms of producing robots and computers and so that now really the bourgeoisie and the proletariat are becoming anachronisms because more and more labor is being produced by machines and workers are becoming more and more displaced. So it really no longer makes sense. And so if you can't sell your labor power, the system goes down. We can't really sell our labor power anymore. So there's although there was a contradiction before between the capitalist and the worker, and we had to bargain to get the best price for our labor power and form unions and stuff, that whole thing is evaporating at this point in time because every day our labor is being replaced, like this new Myers on 13 and Woodward Corners, if anybody's been there. All the checkout now is self-checkout.
You don't have any?
There's no
Flush and
cashiers,
blood energy?
there's no baggers, and this is the trend that's going to continue and continue, which is really forcing us to become revolutionaries because we can't do things in the old way anymore. Every day it's becoming more and more difficult. And we're producing more wealth now so that everybody can live well. You know, there's more than enough for everybody.
There's no reason, yeah, that it has to be with them.
David, you had your...
Yeah, I don't think we can get into some of the questions you raised about different historical periods under socialism and so-called communism. But remember, this method that we're studying here, which we're going to study more of, allows us to say, we're not going to just say, oh, that was an evil person or that was a good person.
Right.
We're going to see how the world historical movement, the rise, the strength of the imperialists versus problems of the revolution, these things can be analyzed and should be and have been analyzed by, you know, really important thinkers to explain why these things happen. You know, even Marx wrote a book on the Paris Commune, you know, and they made a lot of mistakes, the leaders. They didn't have a long time to prove themselves one way or another. That lasted about 60 days. But Marx spent a profound book to analyze what happened, why it had initial success, why it failed. And you can do the same thing with the 1905, every revolution. The Bolshevik Revolution, study that. The Chinese Revolution has ups and downs of all kinds, but they're not just accidental. It's not just violence like he talks about, chaotic violence,
Right.
or just good ideas. You know, there were certain changes that made to the material basis. And so that could be, I think that's a whole separate, about 20 classes we could do on that. I had a couple other points. I'm not sure that I agree with David over there, because there are still 180 million workers in this country.
It's a process.
They may be not in the factories so much, but they are in new kinds of factories, Amazon, et cetera,
Yeah, I was gonna
and
mention that.
unions.
That's being automated too.
Well,
Hiring
and
people
yet
every day,
still,
yeah, right.
we have 180 million workers, they're not all being eliminated.
Takes
And,
time.
okay, let me just finish then. And so the question of unionization isn't, it may be more difficult or more complex, but this class hasn't disappeared, the working class and the capitalist class. Certainly not on U.S., not in the world scale. So I'll leave it there.
Well, I think that, like you were saying, the evil, how, you know, as soon as the Russian Revolution, or in the process, we started having propaganda in this country against that system. They were so afraid.
That's what I'm saying. There's
And
such
we
a
had troops
disconnect
there.
that you have to come to a class like this in order to understand that
Well,
it's
that's
not
what
the
I
way
wanted
it's
to say.
painted. And then you start to get into the guts of that. But how many people really do that? And how does the knowledge that we're learning here mainstream itself in a populace who isn't even willing to look at it? But, sorry,
Well, yeah, and then I don't know, both of you have something else that you want to say.
Well, I was just gonna mention, in terms of the capitalist system, I mean, it evolves as well and develops, and Amazon is a good example of that, you know? I mean, if you look how they operate, it's very similar to the way industry operated 100 years ago. I mean, it's different, but the way they manage people, micromanage people, the anti-union hostility was the same thing that workers were facing 100 years ago, less than 100 years ago. And they're expanding, and they're driving other capitalists out of business in the same way that the railroads did 100, 120, 130 years ago. Same thing in the auto industry. So, you know, and then production now is worldwide. So you have plants in Europe, Asia, Africa that are producing automobiles. There are new markets being created. So, yeah, I mean, it's still, you know, it's still very much a dynamic process, and they still need people to work. You know, I mean, it's developments here is obvious. You know, in the last 5, 6 years, people are making less money, but more people are working. So they just need to be organized. You know?
2-3 jobs.
Yeah,
So,
that's why we support D15. Yeah, right.
So let me just touch on, I think that's the most important question you raised, is, you know, how do we get this message to the mass of the people? And of course, it's very difficult numerically, and always was difficult. The communist movement was never that big, of different threads of it. But it wasn't the communists who converted the mass of the people. It was the capitalist repression and exploitation. And I think it's important to note, you know, while in some ways the communist movement in the U.S. is in disarray and actually dangerously weak, it's the most pro-socialist generation there is. I mean, a lot of us are not discouraged, we're encouraged. You know, now Sanders could talk about socialism. 20 years ago, you couldn't mention that word. You had to be very careful who you even told. Now he may not be our kind of socialist, but the term itself is not anathema anymore. And we have to find a way into those movements, you know, and we also, you know, it's not, I mean, we study communism here, dialectics, materialism, we study all that to make ourselves sharper, and it's not just some history book and some old stuff. We're doing it because we're constantly trying to figure out, and we do it on a weekly basis in our more mass organizations that we belong in, and whether it's just Moratorium Now or whether you're in a union or whatever, a book club, to try to figure out how to bring an approach which doesn't necessarily wave a red flag. You know, the bankruptcy here was a profound attack on the working class city, and tens of thousands of retired workers were massacred. But we entered it. We were in the court. We were in the street. We found the slogans that the unions wouldn't touch, that the religious figure, even the progressive movement wouldn't touch, and it was summarized in "Make the banks pay." That was on our T-shirt. Hands off my pension, make the banks pay. And we're doing it now with the tax thing. You know, we put a leaflet out which supports what a lot of people are talking about, how the property taxes were exploitative. Well, we're trying to find a way to take it into a further where it really challenges the system. We call those, sometimes we call them transitional demands. They're not necessarily clearly communist demands, but they start to take on the capitalist system, or especially the banking system. So, yeah, we need to figure out ways to get them stuff out, but there's a lot of young people, and you know, we need to figure out how to bring them, and we also know the need of a core group of revolutionaries who trust each other, know how to work together, who can intervene, because there are many misleaders, whether they're maybe well-intentioned misleaders like Bernie Sanders or whatever, or more likely more reactionary misleaders and even racist misleaders. And those are all going to be out there, and we need to find a way. And that can only, we know from Leninism that the only way we can do that is with a disciplined revolutionary socialist, or if you want to call it communist, grouping that can move quickly and clearly on a lot of issues.
Yeah, well, thanks a lot.
I'm getting out of
Jason, for putting this second.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
I don't, Derek wants us to say.
Yeah, I'm just gonna say, what I was getting out of this, I think what we all come to the conclusion that the world, this political system, capitalism, is in dialectics. It's evolving, and that's why our analysis is gonna have to always change. You know, like some people feel like, you know, a lot of different groups, you know, are still stuck on the same analysis of a situation that is evolving, and they need to change their way of thinking, and that's hard for them to do, and that's why we don't have the solidarity that we need, you know, because they're still thinking, you know, in the olden days, you know, and things is changing constantly, so our analysis has to change.
That was a real good presentation at the General Baker Institute Tuesday about unionization in Detroit. Who wrote Work in Detroit again? I forgot, but he spoke. And what he said was prior to the formation of the UAW, you know, they had the AFL, which was based on trades. It was pretty much lily white, and that nobody even thought they could organize an industrial union which would have women and men and blacks and whites and immigrants. They just thought it was impossible to do. And the dialectical transformation that took place with the formation of the UAW is they did it. And now we have a working class that isn't just concentrated in these large factories the way it used to be. It's dispersed. It's not unionized. You may be working 2 or 3 jobs. You might be like they say, the precariat. You're on a contract, or it's just not the same class that it was before. And people say, well, how the hell are you going to organize that? Well, It happened before, and it can happen again, and as the system breaks down and destructs itself, because they can't get the surplus value that they used to get, people are open to new ideas. And we have those ideas that explain, what the situation, what the circumstances, and what needs to be done to take this to another level.
One other thing that we need to do, we need to think globally as well. That there are workers in many other parts of the world that we should be in solidarity with. So even as we wage a struggle against our own bourgeoisie, we need to extend sincere and deep solidarity to workers in other countries fighting their own bourgeoisie, or fighting actually against U.S. imperialism and NATO many times.
I wish the average person isn't even aware of, because
Right,
our.
but that's
our
where
None of
so-
our tax dollars.
But that's what one of the differences between us and the Social Democrats. The DSA, in a way, could be translated into domestic socialists of America, because they don't really embrace the worldwide struggle. There are many within DSA that do, though, but they're not. That's not the mainstream. That's not the Bernie Sanders leadership. That's not their perspective. So, for example, we would extend our deepest solidarity with the Venezuelan people, the Venezuelan government, and you'll find Bernie Sanders attacking. So as we go and explain what we're trying to do, we also have to explain the international circumstances and what's going on worldwide. With regard to the precariat or whatever, at the turn of the last century, 1890s to before World War I, people like Mark Twain and Upton Sinclair were writing about the precarious nature of the working class as well. Back then, you would go into a hiring hall and you fought with, or you competed with other workers to get a job for one day. That was very precarious, and it took the unions you were talking about to give us a sense that we're entitled to a paycheck after 2 weeks of work. That wasn't always true in this country. So in a way, we're not becoming something new. We're unwinding and going back to something that was always there.
We've lost some of our strength.
Well, we've lost our strength, but that doesn't mean we're not a working class still. And we need to organize, and anyway, I disagree with the notion of,
I didn't say we're not a working class, because obviously,
Well,
all we have to sell is our labor power, so
Right.
we are the
But-
working class.
but in many parts of the world, the working class is very precarious as well. Ask a Latino worker, who works, and they used to gather in front of Home Depot 10 years ago, right? That was very precarious work. You might work for a day, you might not. The person grabbing you might work you for a week, or might not. So it's still working class, and we still need to organize and go forward.
Are we gonna do a third part?
Yeah, so the third chapter, this one was only 6 pages. I think the third chapter is very long. So we might need to break it up.
Okay.
I don't know. I mean, I could like
We'll
look,
have to let people know, because we
look
don't
at-
have our schedule.
yeah, I mean, I could look
Maybe
at
the
it right
14th,
now. I was
March
thinking,
14th?
No, we said we wouldn't be doing some of this stuff.
Okay, all right, maybe April.
do we have a date or?
No, the 7th is out, the
It's International
21st
Women's
is
Day,
out
yeah.
for us. The 14th, we said we weren't gonna set up anything
Right.
that day.
So maybe April,
Okay.
yeah.
Well, that
Late
might
March
give more
or
time
early
because the
April.
third one is
We could
more
let people
digest.
know.
We can figure that out on the
Facebook.
29th.
I'm just trying to see,
March 4th is
add it
the
up here.
pubic hair
The
ban.
second one.
April 4th.
No, April 4th, I'm sorry, yeah.
Okay, so the third chapter is, I think, about twice as long as the second.
Okay.
Goes far.
So maybe it's even longer than the first one, but we can see. I mean,
Do
we'll
folks wanna have a
Yeah,
continue?
yes, yes, yes.
Most definitely.
I just want to thank you, Jason,
Yeah.
for doing
Thank you.
so
Thanks for-
well prepared and on top of the material, and it just was a joy.
Yeah.
And we
Well, I look forward to
welcome,
doing part 3 too, also.
so
I hope-
so
I hope
before
everybody-
part 3, we welcome everybody back to all of our different classes and meetings that we have, so
Yeah.
don't feel like you gotta wait until this next class to come back. Because
International
we're doing
Women's-
something every week.
International Women's Day is on there.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
So we'll
Thanks a
announce
lot.
that.
All right.
All right.
I was just pointing out a fact.